Hello, and a very warm welcome to this podcast from Management Futures. I'm Hugh Reynolds, Head of Learner Experience and Engagement, and in this mini-series I'm going to have a four-part conversation with my colleague and friend John Bull. He's MF's Director of High Performance, and we'll meet John in a moment and we'll explain why we're so excited to talk together about adaptive leadership. But if you'd like to find out more about our work, please get in touch. You can find our details on the team page at www.managementfutures.co.uk, along with all sorts of helpful insights, tools, videos and resources. Thanks so much for tuning in to us, to who we are and to what we do. We really hope you enjoy this chat. John, hello again for the third of our conversations around adaptive leadership and adaptive challenges. And we've already spoken about what adaptive leadership is. We've spoken a bit about organisations that are doing it. And we've spoken quite a lot about the skills that leaders can adopt and can inhabit in order to adapt to adaptive challenge. And in this part of a conversation, I'd really love to get a handle on the traps that leaders can fall into, okay, that stop them perhaps from being such an effective adaptive leader. So you've been writing about this, you've been working with organizations and teams around this issue, and some of the things that stand out to me are things about we joked about this earlier, this word Weltanschauung, and forgive me any German listeners, I mean the worldview. So where we've got a sort of mindset that's accommodated to an older world and not the new world that we find ourselves in. So having outdated assumptions, that really spoke clearly to me. Other things such as inaction, so not taking action when you've diagnosed a problem, or even taking action before you've done a proper diagnosis of what the problem are. So these are some traps that jumped out to me from your work, but you tell me, what are people struggling with at the moment around these common traps?
Yeah, so I think first thing I would say is to, I guess, depersonalize it. That these are, and it's probably what really fascinates us about them, these are really natural. And I think even people who are really good adaptive leaders and organizations who are really good at adapting fall into these, right? So classical kind of biases, if you like, psychological biases. Yeah, just to use a really prominent example, Microsoft, outstanding adaptive organization, coming up, beating IBM, et cetera, as the small player, et cetera. How does Microsoft, I think they had 96% of the operating software market. How do they miss the move to mobile phones and operating software, which even responding late, they managed to sort of fight for briefly for 10%. But and I think that's important for any leader to hear, is that just these traps are really natural. You're going to fall into them. What you want to do is educate yourself about them so that and it's also easier to spot, for others to spot when we're falling into a trap. So by raising awareness of them in the organization, we can see them in each other, we can call it out. So I think that would be the starting point for me.
Thank you, John. I think also, like, something you've said to me before is around radar, so you keep this on your radar, and it's not a set of skills that you just learn and then apply, but one that you keep monitoring, and you're monitoring yourself and how you're applying those skills. It's a bit of a feedback loop going on there, right?
And there's a phrase in the literature sometimes used about productive paranoia. I know you and I chatted about it, this idea of sort of taking a seemingly negative word I don't know. I still don't know how I feel about the word paranoia, because that has a certain association, but there is something about vigilance. And there is something about just constantly being on the lookout and just assuming no matter how good things are going, something is, it's almost quite sort of Buddhist, I guess. This is, the impermanence. This is going to change. I need to be alert to that. So I think the radar is a really good analogy, because it just reminds us to be, we will be focusing on but from time to time taking some attention to zoom out and go, what's going on. I
Mm.
think what's fascinating to me, the more I've learned actually, Hugh, is so missing important changes. That's an obvious trap, and we see other organizations do that. We kind of marvel at that, or we might be frustrated at that as a customer. I actually think what's much more common is where people see the need for change but don't act on it.
Mhm.
Right. And I think we're all living through this with climate change at the moment. I imagine you're better than me on this, but I am, there's a paradox inside of me. I am at one really passionate about the importance of a need and make some choices, but absolutely are not making other choices, which I should be doing as a so I think that trap of seeing the need but not having sufficient urgency, I think is even more common. Um, Two others that I would mention you touched on. I think the the sort of this might be unfair, but I would say the sort of traditional approach to strategic planning, which is where you do the strategic planning and then you do execution,
Mhm.
um, just um, doesn't work in this environment. Just doesn't work. So you have that famous quote of "No plan lasts more than 30 minutes engagement with the enemy." I think that's really really accurate. It's not that there's anything wrong with planning. We need to do planning, but you need to be super flexible around it. So I think inflexibility of plans. People mistake activity for outcomes. So they keep doing stuff, whether it's working or not. So I think you mentioned empirical, one of our earlier conversations, just constantly checking out, is this taking us forward? Are we moving in the right direction? Has the environment um, changed? I think is the other. And then the final one, this is the one I've definitely been putting a lot more focus on with clients recently is actually, once the organization's done some really good adaptive work, has a new fit for purpose strategy, a great strategy, is the piece they've not thought enough about is, well, how do we mobilize the organization behind that new strategy?
Mhm.
Um, because those changes, so you talked about out of date assumptions. I
Mhm.
think, I think one of the really interesting things where adaptive leadership gets really difficult is where it requires us to depart from something we're really loyal to or challenges of value, etc. So where you have to shift something that's quite unpopular in an organization, um, and that's not new, but organizations just not able to mobilize the people quick enough to be able to do that.
So
Not
just
dealing
to,
with that conflict.
I see. So to clarify what the trap is not attending sufficiently to the emotional or the
Yeah,
heartfelt
yeah,
aspects
yeah.
of
Um,
this change.
Very well summarized back. Um, it's, I think the trap is ignoring the conflict,
Mm.
actually, and just
Mm.
going, it's kind of buying into the thing because I'm a leader and I say we're going to do this, people will fall into that and give full energy. Well, that's just naive,
Mhm.
right? So it's not paying enough attention to transition. How do I get people on board with why we're doing this, get them to understand it, work through what their concerns are, so we're all completely, we're able to disagree, but then commit to
Mhm.
to what we're going to do.
So I mentioned about the emotions of the people that you're working with as an adaptive leader, and these are people that, as we've explored in our previous conversations or mini conversations around this, it's about bringing more people into the circle of conversation and finding out what their needs are and what their advice is, what their thoughts are around this. We're thinking about them as real complex systems, yeah, emotional people, entities, people with values and beliefs and strong held things, right? So this is why it's a complex issue, all this around adaptive challenge. I'm interested in the emotions of the leader, though, right? So I'm thinking when something has happened, a curveball's hit me, and I get an urge to give a knee-jerk initial response, something emotional, or gut. I might have sent you some emails like quickly, like when I'm really cross about something. Okay, how might we avoid that trap? How do we get around that urge to just react?
So it's a great question, Hugh. I would so step back a bit, and I think one of the great insights in adaptive leadership is really good adaptive leaders have a dual radar. So I found this very powerful in my own learning around this, that you're scanning the external environment for what's changing, but you're then scanning how am I responding to
Mm,
that, right? So
mhm,
you are there's a phrase sort of hyper self-aware because you know you're going into a situation where your response
mm,
may be less than ideal.
mhm,
And so you're kind of just more alert to what's going on internally. So I think that's the first step is just to be more tuned in
mhm,
so you will pick up where your response is not resourceful earlier. We've talked in this space, we've constantly gone to what can we learn from leaders who have been operating in this environment for longer and have developed some capability around it. So if you look at disaster relief, if you look at the, special forces, etc., they all have a very common methodology, which is something along the lines of in the special forces, it's take a breath,
mhm,
um, observe, make a call, prioritize and execute, make a call. I'm really taken by the first step in that, which where everyone else is going, act, need to do
mhm.
something. Their first step is take a breath. So it
Yeah.
can be a very short amount of time, but the first step is compose. Um,
Mhm,
but in one of our earlier conversations, I was referencing clearly a favorite film of mine, Apollo 13. There's
mhm,
another clip in that when the flight director, Gene Kranz, when everyone is starting to panic in the flight room, just goes, settle down, people, work the problem, call who you need to call.
mhm.
We have 8 minutes to make a decision here. Right. So I think the first step is to recognize where your emotions are not helping, compose yourself, but it's not about relaxing, it's about getting to that right level of urgency. To answer the last part of your question, the way we do that is a lot of fun with clients. The way we train that skill is to
Mhm,
first of all make people aware of the traps. So we raise, awareness of here are the most common traps. People sort of nod sagely and kind of get it and can recognize it. But then we put them into some challenges
mhm.
and get them to recognize how they respond, what their emotions are under pressure, to learn about how they respond, but also to start learning self-management techniques in an environment that doesn't matter. So when they are out trying to adapt in the real world, that they're able to that they have those muscles more developed.
Why is that experiential element important in the training that we do? I spoke recently to our colleague Simon Eastwood, head of leadership skills, about this recently, and I'd love your take on it as well. Why do we bother with experience rather than just telling people, rather than just giving them the book to read or lecturing at them?
I think it'll go back to very similar things that Simon and you would have talked about actually, that effective leadership is only knowledge is only a really small part of that. A large part of it is skill, particularly, and I think it's particularly relevant in adaptive leadership because we're talking about emotions and we're talking about pressure, right? And what you need to do, and if I can borrow from the sport world, we learned a long time ago in elite sport to practice in the same conditions we're going to compete to
Mhm,
hardwire how to respond in the muscles. I think it's the same. You can have a theoretical idea of I need to listen before I respond, and then someone dearly beloved in your family triggers you.
mhm. Yes.
That theory isn't, but to be able to kind of to trigger, to pause, to go, well, what triggered, what was going on there? You just get deeper learning. Um, it's also a lot more fun.
Mm,
It's also, adaptive leadership really lends itself to because we don't have the resources for this, but it's illustrative. What I love, um, UK sport, the elite body in charge of Olympic sports
mhm,
in the UK, worked out they had a recurring pattern that new coaches would turn up to the Olympics and not perform very well because it's the first time they've been in pressure
mhm,
because of the sort of reputation, the resources they had available to them. One of the things they did was took new coaches in the team, the coaching team, to British Airways to put them in flight simulators to basically just throw challenge after challenge after challenge after challenge. Um, Meltdown, respond badly. But the brilliant thing of that is they're learning in an environment that doesn't matter.
mm.
how to get a hold of it. And the results spoke for themselves, actually. When they then turn up to the Olympics, they've got just a much greater understanding of how to navigate those emotions in themselves.
So very similar to sort of coaching in a way, where we provide a safe space to be challenged in, yeah, to have things thrown at us or have things put back to us. That providing that space, holding that space for people seems to be incredibly valuable.
That self-management side, probably more than any other aspect of adaptive leadership, is a learned behavior.
Mhm.
Actually, that's what you're making me think about. So what we are essentially trying to do is create a space to be able to build that muscle and
Mhm.
get confidence
Mm.
around that muscle.
Thank you, John. And thanks for talking about the way that you do it as well, because you turned up today for a conversation about adaptive leadership. Right? And I'm sort of putting you on the spot about how you actually get that into people and get people working with it. So I just want to end this section of our wider conversation about traps by throwing a couple of traps at you and just seeing what your initial response would be or how you might help me out if I kept falling into these traps. Okay. So how about the trap of throwing good out with bad? So I'm trying to adapt to an adaptive challenge, and I've got a plan, and I've listened to people, and I'm trying to put this through. And in the midst of that, other things are getting lost. What are you? What's your advice there? How am I going to get myself out of that?
So for me, it's the importance of the conversation around what do we need to safeguard? What is still relevant? What serves us well? What will be even more important moving forward? And it's um, So for me, it would be the way to deal with that is just to ask a different question,
Hmm.
essentially, which is, yeah, we'll look at what we need to change, but let's also look at what we don't need to change. Referencing to an earlier conversation, it's also who you involve in that.
Hmm.
So I often when you have a turnaround in an organization, you'll bring in new leaders from the outside, and that's important. They can come in, they can disrupt, they have new insights that they bring into the system. You often get this clash between people who are fighting for what we should keep versus people who are trying to change.
Hmm.
But it is so powerful if you get them listening to each other, right?
Mm.
Which is and you just for us that it's a really energizing process. It's often to go back to what are the times when this organization has been outstandingly good? What was that built on? So sometimes actually there are real strengths in the organization that have been hidden somewhere in a back. I'm thinking about the museums in the back sort of room, and
Hmm.
sometimes it's about bringing those treasures out and kind of putting a spotlight back on them.
Sure.
To deal with the trap, though, to answer your question directly, it's a different coaching question. Rather than looking at what we need to change, it's asking the question, what should we absolutely not
Mm.
change?
Yeah. What are the red lines or the untouchable things?
I wouldn't say, interesting enough, I wouldn't say red lines are untouchable,
Hmm.
just because that might just bring out
It's
sacred
another
cows
assumption,
that
right?
people are
Yeah.
really emotionally attached to, but they
Yeah.
are things we should change.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it's a very deliberate question around what what will continue to serve us really well moving
Mm,
forward,
mm.
might be how I would phrase that.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. And for me, it goes back to this metaphor of the balcony that we've mentioned. I don't know how big your balcony is, but getting more people on there to see sort of the wider picture and also maybe have a bit of a sense of perspective in time as well. What you've said there
Yeah,
about what's worked, what's not worked in the past, this kind of thing. So in time and space, we're getting a wider perspective. And that's really appeals to me in having that wider conversation based on evidence from space and time, I guess. Let me throw this last trap at you, John. It's one that you've mentioned, um, or at least you mentioned in your writing and your work around this, is blaming individuals rather than systems, right?
attribution. Fine.
Because it comes to yeah, it comes to attribution, accountability, all these things, right? So if I sense the idea here, and please correct me if I've not got this. I sense the idea is that we're quick to blame people or point to people, maybe even from the balcony, point to people and say, right, it's that over there. And yeah, if we could reposition that to looking at the system in which those individuals operate. Have I got the right sense there?
Yeah, it's to So the most powerful illustration I've seen of this is a principle that's very hardwired into how aviation debriefs critical incidents. So they have a starting principle that you only look at pilot error as the last step. So, and that does come out right. You have negligent bad pilot error, but that's the last thing they will look at. They assume the pilot is trying to do, or the crew are trying to do the best job possible. What is in an environment that doesn't help? So that they have a designed process around it. I think in some ways, I think the trap here is where we're avoiding the need to adapt by going for a scapegoat is, well, that individual is underperforming. So what you'll see organizations can do is, let's say sales start falling. Well, clearly our sales force isn't working. So let's just start sacking sales force. And we put new sales force in and it's still not working. At that point, you've got to start saying, well, hold on, it's not the people. We need to look at that, if it makes sense. So it's just one of the ways we avoid facing up to or seeing the need for adaptation. I think one of the ways to spot this trap is this a one-off? So in the aviation, when an incident happens, the first step they will do is they'll scan wherever we had similar incidents worldwide. So there was a few years ago, there was an incident of one of the new airplanes being rolled out. Pilot had made an error of pushing the wrong button, hadn't put the landing gear down, or something along those lines. They did a quick scan, and it had come up that actually in the last 6 weeks there would have been 6 near misses of the same. So immediately you go, well, really, is it, how likely is it that we've had 6 pilots make the same mistake? There's got to be something about the process or system. They changed the color of the buttons, problem disappeared.
So it's not, we're not saying here that it's never an individual, or not denying that there could be a problem with an individual or individual performance levels, but strategically and looking at that bigger picture, if you're not noticing the patterns, then you're really missing a trick and falling into this trap.
Yeah, maybe this zooms out to another really important. There's loads of important insights in adaptive leadership. But one of them is, in most situations, it will be a mix between what Heifetz called technical problems and adaptive problems. Technical problem being one that actually has a simple solution that we just need to apply. So in some situations, it may well be an individual who's underperforming, and we can address that. I would be looking at, to what extent is it generalized? Is it happening in more places than one?
Sure.
That would tell me this might be an adaptive challenge.
Thanks so much for lending us your ears. We really hope you enjoyed our conversation. And if you'd like to explore more around this topic or other shared interests, do visit us at www.managementfutures.co.uk. There you can find lots more really useful content in our resources section, including lots of cool things John, myself and the team here at MF have developed. Until next time, take care.